Before we begin tonight's story, I'd like to ask you something. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is where you're listening, leave me a comment below. Tell me your location and the time. And if you're here to listen to this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others find these cases that need to be remembered. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about two girls who vanished while riding their bicycles in the English countryside. Two separate cases nearly a decade apart, yet connected by haunting similarities. Two families left with nothing but questions. Two investigations that, despite decades of effort, have never found answers. This is the story of April Fabb and Jeanette Tate. Let's begin with April. April Rose Fabb was born on May 3, 1956, in the county of Norfolk, in the east of England. She grew up in the tiny village of Metton, a place so small it barely appears on most maps. Population in the late 1960s, perhaps 200 souls. The kind of village where everyone knew everyone, where children played freely, where doors were left unlocked and neighbors looked out for one another. April was 13 years old in the spring of 1969. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a ready smile. She was a pupil at South Reps Primary School, doing well in her studies, looking forward to the summer holidays. She was, by all accounts, a responsible, sensible girl. The kind of child parents trusted to run errands, to be out and about in the village without supervision. April lived with her parents and siblings in a cottage on the edge of Metton. Her father worked as a farm laborer. Her mother kept the house and cared for the children. Theirs was a simple life, perhaps not wealthy by urban standards, but rich in the things that matter. Family, community, safety, or so they believed. In 1969, Britain was changing. The optimism of the 1960s was beginning to curdle. The Beatles were fragmenting. The Vietnam War dominated the news. The troubles in Northern Ireland were escalating. But in rural Norfolk, in villages like Metton, life still moved at the pace of the agricultural seasons. Tractors, not traffic. Church bells, not car horns. April had a bicycle, as most children did. It was freedom. It meant she could visit friends in neighboring villages, could ride to the shop, could explore the narrow lanes that wound between fields of wheat and barley. The roads were quiet. Farmers knew to watch for children on bikes. It was safe. Everyone believed it was safe. April's sister Pamela lived in the nearby village of Ruffton, about a mile and a half from Metton. On the afternoon of April 8, 1969, their mother asked April to cycle over to Pamela's house to deliver a packet. A simple errand, a trip April had made many times before. There was no reason to worry. April set off on her bicycle at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a Tuesday. The weather was mild for early April in Norfolk, overcast but dry. Perfect cycling weather. The route from Metton to Ruffton was straightforward. Rural lanes bordered by hedgerows and fields. At that time of day, on a Tuesday afternoon, traffic would be minimal. Perhaps a tractor, perhaps a car or two. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. April never arrived at her sister's house. When April failed to arrive at Pamela's house within a reasonable time, Pamela wasn't immediately alarmed. Perhaps April had stopped to talk to someone. Perhaps she'd taken a longer route. Young girls could be easily distracted. But as the afternoon wore on and April still hadn't appeared, Pamela began to worry. She telephoned her mother. Had April left? When exactly? April's mother confirmed that April had set out around 2 o'clock. It was now after 3:30. The journey should have taken 20 minutes at most, even if April had cycled slowly. Pamela's husband immediately set out to look for April, retracing the route she would have taken. Other family members joined the search. They walked and drove the narrow lanes between Metton and Ruffton, calling April's name, looking for any sign of her. At approximately 4 o'clock, April's bicycle was found. It was lying in the grass verge along Frogs Hall Lane, one of the roads April would have taken. The bicycle was undamaged. It hadn't been in an accident. It appeared to have been simply left there, or placed there, lying on its side in the grass. Near the bicycle, scattered on the ground, were April's personal belongings. Her shoes, the packet she'd been carrying, her coat, but no April. The family immediately contacted the Norfolk Constabulary. By late afternoon, police officers were at the scene. What they found puzzled and disturbed them. The bicycle and belongings were located on a quiet stretch of road between Metton and Ruffton. Fields on either side, a few houses scattered at intervals. Nothing to suggest why April would have stopped there. No mechanical problem with the bicycle. No obvious reason for her to have dismounted. More troubling was the arrangement of her belongings. They weren't scattered as if dropped in a panic or a fall. They appeared to have been placed deliberately, removed and left behind. Police immediately launched a search. Officers combed the fields and ditches along Frogs Hall Lane. They knocked on doors at every house in the area. Had anyone seen April? Had anyone noticed anything unusual that afternoon? Most people had been indoors or at work. Rural Norfolk in April could be bleak. People didn't linger outside without reason. One witness would eventually come forward with information that would form the basis of the investigation for years to come. A resident of Frogs Hall Lane reported seeing a green vehicle, possibly a Morris Minor, driving in the area around the time of April's disappearance. The vehicle had been moving slowly, as if the driver were looking for something or someone. But the witness couldn't provide a clear description of the driver or a registration number. It was just an impression, a memory of something slightly out of place. As darkness fell on April 8, 1969, a 13-year-old girl had vanished from a quiet Norfolk lane in broad daylight. No witnesses to an abduction, no screams heard, no struggle evident, just a bicycle, some belongings, and a terrible absence. The search for April Fab became one of the largest missing person investigations in Norfolk's history. In the days following her disappearance, hundreds of police officers, volunteers, soldiers from a nearby RAF base, and local residents searched the countryside around Metton and Ruffton. They searched fields, woods, barns, outbuildings. They dragged ponds and streams. They used dogs trained in tracking. The investigation was thorough, methodical, desperate. They found nothing. No trace of April beyond what had been discovered on Frogs Hall Lane that first day. No clothing, no body, no evidence of where she had gone or what had happened to her. Detectives interviewed residents of every house within miles of the disappearance site. They compiled lists of men who owned green vehicles matching the description of the car seen in the area. They checked alibi after alibi. The investigation focused on the theory that seemed most likely given the evidence. April had been abducted, probably by someone in a vehicle, someone who had either specifically targeted her or had taken an opportunity that presented itself. But who, and why, and where was April? The packet April had been carrying to her sister was found among her belongings. It hadn't been taken. Neither had her bicycle, which, while not valuable, could have been stolen if theft were the motive. This suggested that whoever took April had no interest in her possessions. They had wanted April herself. The implications were horrifying for her family to contemplate. Police looked at known offenders in the area, men with records of violence or sexual offenses. They investigated traveling salesmen, delivery drivers, anyone who might have had a reason to be on those roads that day. They pursued hundreds of leads, most of which led nowhere. One theory that gained traction involved a fairground or circus that had been in the general area around the time of April's disappearance. Traveling shows often employed transient workers, men whose backgrounds were difficult to verify, who moved from place to place. Could one of them have been responsible? Investigators looked into this possibility but could find no concrete connection. As weeks turned into months, the active search scaled down. Police maintained their investigation, but without new leads, without new evidence, there was only so much they could do. The case remained open, but the likelihood of finding April alive diminished with each passing day. For April's family, the not knowing was torture. Was she alive somewhere, held captive? Had she been killed and her body hidden so well it would never be found? The human mind can imagine terrible things when faced with such absence of information. Her parents never gave up hope. They kept April's room exactly as she'd left it. They marked every birthday, every Christmas, with the ache of her absence. They cooperated with police, gave interviews to newspapers, did everything they could to keep April's case in the public consciousness. But as the years passed, other cases, other tragedies, pushed April's story further from the front pages. By the mid-1970s, the investigation had gone cold. And then, in 1978, something happened that would bring renewed attention to April Fabb's case. Another girl vanished while riding her bicycle in rural England. Jeanette Tate was born on February 13, 1965, in the county of Devon, in southwest England. By the summer of 1978, she was 13 years old, the same age April Fabb had been when she disappeared 9 years earlier. Jeanette lived in the village of Aylesbury, another small rural community, this one in the rolling hills of Devon. The village was slightly larger than Metton, but still the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Safe, quiet, unremarkable. Jeanette was a bright, cheerful girl. She had dark hair and a friendly disposition. She did well at school and was popular with her classmates. She was reliable and responsible, the kind of child who could be trusted with responsibilities. One of those responsibilities was her paper round. In 1978, it was common for teenagers to have paper rounds, delivering newspapers to houses in their local area. It was a way to earn pocket money, to learn responsibility, to contribute. Jeanette had been doing her paper round for some time. She knew the route well. She rode her bicycle, stopping at each house on her list to deliver that day's newspaper. Her route took her along the narrow lanes around Aylesbury. Rural roads, much like those April Fabb would have cycled in Norfolk 9 years earlier. Quiet, peaceful, safe. Saturday, August 19, 1978, was a warm summer day in Devon. School holidays, long evenings, the kind of day that seemed to promise nothing but pleasant ordinariness. Jeanette set off on her paper round at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. She was accompanied for part of the route by two friends, also on their bicycles. The three girls cycled together, chatting and laughing, delivering papers to houses along the way. At approximately 4 o'clock, Jeanette's two friends turned off to head home. Their routes diverged from Jeanette's at that point. They said goodbye to Jeanette and watched her cycle off down Whithen Lane, continuing her paper round alone. Those two friends were the last known people to see Jeanette Tate. Within minutes of parting from her friends, Jeanette Tate vanished. The exact sequence of events is unclear, reconstructed from fragments of witness testimony and physical evidence. But what is known is this. At approximately 4:05 p.m., a witness driving along Whithen Lane saw Jeanette's bicycle lying on its side in the road. The front wheel was still spinning, as if the bicycle had only just been dropped or fallen. The witness stopped, puzzled. Why would a bicycle be abandoned in the road with its wheel still spinning? Where was the rider? The witness looked around. The area was rural, open fields on one side, a wooded area on the other. Houses were scattered and set back from the road. No one was visible. Scattered near the bicycle were newspapers, still in their delivery bag. Jeanette's personal belongings, her shoes, but no Jeanette. The witness, increasingly alarmed, immediately drove to the nearest house and asked the residents to call the police. Within minutes, officers from the Devon and Cornwall Constabulary were responding to the scene. What they found was eerily similar to what Norfolk police had discovered 9 years earlier on Frogs Hall Lane. A bicycle apparently abandoned suddenly, personal items scattered or placed nearby, a spinning wheel suggesting the incident had occurred only moments before discovery, and a 13-year-old girl missing without a trace. The immediate area was searched. Officers called Jeanette's name. They looked in ditches in the wooded area in nearby fields. Nothing. One detail stood out to investigators: the spinning wheel. The witness who found the bicycle had arrived within minutes of Jeanette's disappearance, certainly less than 5 minutes based on the wheel's momentum. This meant that whatever happened to Jeanette had happened very quickly. She'd been there one moment, gone the next. There had been no time for her to wander off, no time for a slow-developing situation. Someone had taken her, and they'd done it in broad daylight on a summer afternoon in a matter of seconds or minutes. The response to Jeanette's disappearance was immediate and massive. Police, aided by hundreds of volunteers, searched the countryside around Aylesbury. The investigation was one of the largest Devon had ever undertaken. Search parties combed through fields, woodlands, abandoned buildings. Divers searched rivers and ponds. Helicopters surveyed the area from above. The searches continued for weeks, covering hundreds of square miles. They found nothing. As with April Fab, Jeanette seemed to have vanished completely. No body, no clothing, no evidence of where she'd been taken or what had happened to her. Detectives immediately noted the similarities between Jeanette's disappearance and April Fab's case 9 years earlier. Both girls were 13. Both had been cycling alone on quiet rural roads. Both had their bicycles and belongings left behind. Both had vanished in a matter of minutes in broad daylight with no witnesses to an abduction. Could the cases be connected? Was the same person responsible for both disappearances? The geographical distance between Devon and Norfolk was significant, over 200 miles. But it wasn't impossible that someone could be responsible for both crimes. Serial offenders were known to travel, to operate in different areas to avoid detection. Police from Devon and Norfolk coordinated their investigations. They compared evidence, looked for common factors, tried to find connections between the two cases. One person of interest emerged in Jeanette's case. Robert Black, a Scottish serial killer who would eventually be convicted of murdering 3 young girls and abducting a 4th in the 1980s. Black had worked as a delivery driver, traveling extensively throughout the UK. His pattern of offending involved taking opportunities as they presented themselves, abducting girls quickly and efficiently from roadsides. Could Black have been responsible for Jeanette's disappearance? Possibly for April's as well? Police investigated this connection extensively. Black was eventually questioned about both cases. He had no solid alibi for the day of Jeanette's disappearance, and couldn't be ruled out for April's either. But he never confessed to either crime, and no physical evidence linked him to the cases. Robert Black died in prison in 2016, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. Other suspects were investigated over the years. Men with records of sexual offenses. Men who had lived in or traveled through both Norfolk and Devon during the relevant time periods. But no charges were ever brought. No arrests were made. For the families of both girls, the investigations brought renewed attention to their cases, but no answers. No closure. No justice. For the Fab family and the Tate family, the years following their daughters' disappearances were marked by unimaginable grief and frustration. April's parents, Bernard and Edith Fab, spent the rest of their lives hoping for answers. They never moved from their cottage in Metton, maintaining April's room, keeping her memory alive. They cooperated with every police appeal, every renewed investigation, every lead that emerged over the decades. Bernard Fab died in 2001, 32 years after April's disappearance, without ever learning what happened to his daughter. Edith survived until 2006, carrying the same burden of not knowing. Jeanette's parents, John and Sheila Tate, faced a similar ordeal. They held out hope for years that Jeanette might be alive somewhere, perhaps held captive, perhaps suffering from amnesia. As the years became decades, that hope faded, but the need for answers never did. John Tate became a vocal advocate for missing persons' families, working with charities and organizations dedicated to searching for the disappeared. He gave interviews, participated in documentaries, never stopped fighting for his daughter's case to remain active. Sheila Tate died in 2013, 35 years after Jeanette vanished. John continued the search alone until his own death in 2016. Like the Fabs before them, they died without answers. Both cases remain officially open. Both are still classified as active investigations, though the likelihood of new evidence emerging after so many decades is minimal. In 2017, nearly 40 years after Jeanette's disappearance, police excavated a field in Devon based on new information. The dig lasted several weeks. Media attention was intense. The families of both April and Jeanette hoped this might finally bring answers. Nothing was found. Over the decades, theories have abounded. Some investigators believe both girls were murdered shortly after their abductions. Their bodies hidden so well they've never been discovered. Others theorize they may have been taken far from where they disappeared, possibly even out of the country. The most haunting possibility is that the person or persons responsible are still alive, still free, having literally gotten away with murder. April Fab would be 55 years old today if she's still alive. Jeanette Tate would be 47. Two women who never got to become women. Two lives cut short or stolen away in their childhood. Their cases represent everything that's heartbreaking about unsolved disappearances. Loving families left without answers. Communities forever marked by tragedy. Investigations that exhausted every lead but found no resolution. The similarities between the cases continue to haunt investigators and researchers. Two 13-year-old girls. Two bicycles abandoned on quiet rural roads. Two disappearances occurring in broad daylight with extraordinary speed and efficiency. Two cases with no bodies, no witnesses, no conclusion. Were they connected? Was the same person responsible for both? Or are the similarities merely tragic coincidence? Two separate predators operating in similar ways, taking similar opportunities? We may never know. What we do know is that April Fab and Jeanette Tate deserve to be remembered. Their names should not fade into obscurity. Their families' decades of grief and searching deserve recognition. Their cases deserve to remain open until they're solved, no matter how long that takes. Somewhere, someone knows something. In cases this old, witnesses who were afraid to speak in 1969 or 1978 may no longer have reason to fear. People who were children then are now adults, perhaps grandparents themselves. Deathbed confessions happen. Long-held secrets sometimes surface. The police forces investigating these cases continue to appeal for information. If you know anything about the disappearances of April Fab or Jeanette Tate, no matter how insignificant it might seem, the Devon and Cornwall Police and the Norfolk Constabulary want to hear from you. Tips can be provided anonymously. After so many years, there may be no legal consequences for coming forward with information. But there could be peace, finally, for families who have waited decades for answers. April and Jeanette were real girls with real lives ahead of them. They had dreams, plans, futures that were stolen. They had families who loved them and never stopped searching. They have communities that never forgot them. Their stories remind us that evil exists, that predators walk among us, that vigilance is necessary even in the quietest, seemingly safest places. They remind us that justice delayed is justice denied, but that the pursuit of justice must never cease. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share the stories of April Fab and Jeanette Tate. Keep their cases alive. Sometimes, keeping a case in the public consciousness is what finally brings a breakthrough. Two girls, two bicycles, two families, one terrible mystery that spans decades. April Fab and Jeanette Tate deserve answers. Their families deserve closure. And somewhere, someone has information that could provide both. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering April and Jeanette. Story 2. Before we begin tonight, I need you to do something for me. Look at the time right now. Think about where you are in the world. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and what time it is there. And if you're here to listen to this story, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others find these cases that need to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 14-year-old girl who vanished from the streets of a British seaside town in 2003. A girl from a troubled background who fell through the cracks of the system meant to protect her. A case that would expose dark secrets about exploitation, about failure, about a community that didn't notice when one of its most vulnerable children disappeared. This is the story of Charlene Downs. Blackpool, Lancashire, England. If you've never been to Blackpool, you need to understand what kind of place it is to understand this story. Blackpool is a seaside resort town on England's northwest coast, facing the Irish Sea. In its Victorian heyday and through much of the 20th century, it was the premier holiday destination for working-class families from across the north of England. The Blackpool Tower, modeled after the Eiffel Tower, dominates the skyline. The Pleasure Beach amusement park draws millions of visitors each year. The illuminations, miles of elaborate light displays along the seafront, attract tourists every autumn. The piers, the arcades, the fish and chip shops, the candy floss vendors. Blackpool was built on tourism, on entertainment, on providing escape and pleasure. But by the early 2000s, Blackpool was a town in transition. Budget airlines had made foreign holidays affordable for ordinary families. The Spanish Costas offered guaranteed sunshine that Blackpool's changeable weather couldn't match. The tourists still came, but the town's glory days were behind it. Blackpool in 2003 was a place of contrasts. The glittering seafront attractions masked deeper social problems. Poverty, drug addiction, homelessness, unemployment. The seasonal nature of tourism meant that many residents struggled during the long winters when visitors were scarce. Into this environment, Charlene Downs was born on March 25, 1989. Charlene grew up in a council estate in Blackpool, in a family that struggled with many of the challenges common to that environment. Her childhood was not easy. Her family life was chaotic at times. She was known to social services, as were many children in similar circumstances. By the time Charlene reached her early teenage years, she was what social workers call a vulnerable child. She was increasingly independent, often out on the streets, mixing with older teenagers and adults. She had a difficult relationship with authority, with school, with structure. Charlene was small for her age, with dark hair and a pretty face. Those who knew her described her as friendly, chatty, someone who seemed older than her years in some ways and heartbreakingly young in others. She craved attention, affection, acceptance. She found all three in the worst possible places. By 2003, when she was 14 years old, Charlene had become a fixture in Blackpool's town center, particularly around the area near the North Pier and the network of side streets behind the main promenade. This area was home to numerous takeaway food shops, cheap hotels, amusement arcades, and small businesses catering to tourists and locals alike. Charlene spent her time hanging around these establishments. She knew many of the owners and workers. They knew her. She was given free food sometimes, allowed to shelter from the cold in their shops, treated with a friendliness that she perhaps didn't receive elsewhere. But there was a darker side to these relationships that no one fully understood at the time. In the autumn of 2003, social services were aware that Charlene was at risk. She'd been reported missing from home multiple times. She was suspected of being sexually exploited by older men. Attempts had been made to intervene to safeguard her, but Charlene was 14 and willful, and the systems meant to protect children like her were fragmented and ineffective. On November 1, 2003, Charlene left her home in Blackpool. She was never seen again. Saturday, November 1, 2003. It was late afternoon when Charlene left her family's home on Buchanan Street. She told her mother she was going into town. This was not unusual. Charlene often spent her weekends in Blackpool's town center, in the area around the seafront and the takeaway shops she frequented. Her mother had no particular reason to worry beyond the general concern any parent of a troubled teenager carries. Charlene would come home when she came home. She always had before. But that evening, Charlene didn't come home. At first, this wasn't alarming. Charlene had stayed out overnight before, crashing at friends' houses or simply sleeping rough. Her family was used to her absences. They expected her to turn up eventually, as she always had. But Sunday passed, then Monday, then Tuesday. By midweek, Charlene's family began to realize something was different about this absence. Usually, even when Charlene stayed away from home, she'd make contact, let someone know she was okay, turn up somewhere familiar. But this time, there was nothing. No sightings, no phone calls, no messages through friends. On November 5, 2003, 4 days after Charlene was last seen, her family reported her missing to Lancashire police. The initial police response was measured. Charlene was known to officers. She'd been reported missing multiple times before, always turning up eventually. She was a troubled teenager, part of a demographic that frequently went missing temporarily. The assumption was that she'd surface within a few days. But as the days turned into weeks, a different picture began to emerge. Detectives started retracing Charlene's movements on November 1st. They spoke with her family, her friends, the staff at the various takeaway shops and businesses she frequented. They built a timeline of her last known day. Charlene had been seen by multiple witnesses in the town center on the afternoon and early evening of November 1st. She'd visited several of her usual haunts, the kebab shops and food outlets where she was known. She'd been her usual self, chatty, friendly, nothing obviously wrong. The last confirmed sighting of Charlene was at approximately 7:30 p.m. on November 1st, near the North Pier area. After that, she seemed to vanish. No one saw her get into a car. No one witnessed an abduction or a struggle. No one heard screams or saw anything suspicious. She was there, and then she wasn't. As detectives dug deeper, they began to uncover a disturbing picture of Charlene's life in the weeks and months before her disappearance. What police discovered as they investigated Charlene's disappearance was troubling not just for what it revealed about her case, but for what it suggested about a wider problem in Blackpool and potentially other towns like it. Charlene, it emerged, had been spending significant amounts of time with older men, many of them workers or owners of takeaway food shops in the town center. She'd formed what appeared to be relationships with these men, receiving gifts, money, food, and attention in exchange for sexual activity. This was child sexual exploitation, though the term wasn't widely used in 2003 in the way it is now. What was happening to Charlene and potentially other young girls in Blackpool wasn't recognized by many people as the systematic abuse it was. Instead, it was often dismissed as troubled teenagers making bad choices, as girls who were asking for it or were somehow complicit in their own exploitation. Detectives began interviewing the men Charlene had been associating with. Many were workers at takeaway food establishments. Some were owners of such businesses. The majority were from South Asian backgrounds, though this was not exclusively the case. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of a child who had been groomed and exploited by multiple adult men. She'd been given alcohol and drugs. She'd been taken to flats and hotel rooms. She'd been passed between different men. She'd been treated not as a child who needed protection, but as a willing participant in adult activities. Some of the men claimed they'd believed Charlene was older than 14. She wore makeup, dressed older than her years, and could pass for 16 or 17 to someone who didn't look too closely. But others must have known her real age. She was a local girl, known in the community. Her youth was obvious to anyone who spent time with her. The investigation began to focus on several individuals in particular. Men who had been seen with Charlene multiple times. Men who couldn't adequately account for their whereabouts on November 1st. Men whose stories changed when pressed. Two names emerged as primary suspects: Iyad Al-Batiki and Mohammed Raveshi, both involved in the food takeaway business in Blackpool. But suspicion is not evidence. And without Charlene, without a body, without witnesses to a crime, building a case would prove extraordinarily difficult. The search for Charlene Downs was extensive. Police searched properties throughout Blackpool, including the takeaway shops and premises associated with the men under suspicion. They searched wasteland, parks, the beach. They used ground-penetrating radar in certain locations. They followed hundreds of leads. They found nothing. No body. No forensic evidence linking anyone to Charlene's disappearance. No witnesses who could definitively say what had happened to her on November 1st. But rumors began to circulate, whispers that would eventually become one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. There were claims, never proven, that Charlene had been murdered and that her body had been disposed of in a particularly horrific way. The rumors suggested that her remains had been destroyed using equipment available in a commercial food preparation environment. The specifics are too disturbing to detail, but the implication was that evidence of murder had been literally obliterated. These rumors would later become part of the police investigation, based on supposed conversations that had been intercepted through covert surveillance. But the validity of this evidence would become hotly contested. What was clear was that Charlene had simply vanished. In a busy town center, on a Saturday evening when tourists and locals would have been out in numbers, A 14-year-old girl had disappeared without a trace. The investigation expanded to look at whether Charlene might have run away, perhaps to another city. Her photograph was circulated nationally. Appeals were made on television and in newspapers, but there were no credible sightings. No evidence that Charlene had left Blackpool voluntarily. Detectives came to believe that Charlene had died on or shortly after November 1, 2003. They believed her death had been the result of foul play, and they believed the answers lay somewhere in the network of takeaway shops and the men who worked in them. But belief is not proof, and in British law, a conviction requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. In 2007, 4 years after Charlene's disappearance, Mohammed Raveshi and Iyad al-Batiki were charged with her murder. The case against them rested heavily on covert surveillance recordings made by police. In these recordings, the defendants allegedly made statements that could be interpreted as admissions or knowledge of Charlene's fate. The prosecution argued that these statements, combined with the evidence of Charlene's association with the defendants, constituted a case for murder. The trial began in 2008. It was a media sensation. The allegations were shocking. The suggestion that a child had been murdered and her body disposed of in the manner alleged caused revulsion and outrage. But as the trial progressed, serious problems with the prosecution's case emerged. The surveillance recordings, which formed the backbone of the case, were of poor quality. The conversations were in a mixture of English and Arabic. The transcriptions and translations were disputed. What the prosecution claimed were admissions of guilt, the defense argued were misunderstandings, mistranslations, or statements taken out of context. Furthermore, there was no physical evidence, no body, no forensic proof that Charlene had even been at the locations where she was alleged to have been murdered. No witnesses to a killing. The defense argued that while the defendants may have had inappropriate contact with Charlene, there was no proof they had murdered her. The case was circumstantial, based on ambiguous statements and suspicion rather than solid evidence. In May 2008, the trial collapsed. The judge directed the jury to return not guilty verdicts on all charges. The case, he ruled, simply did not meet the threshold required for a conviction. The acquittals were devastating for Charlene's family. They believed justice had failed. They believed their daughter's killers had walked free. But the legal system had concluded there wasn't sufficient evidence to convict. The presumption of innocence, the requirement for proof beyond reasonable doubt, these fundamental principles of justice had protected men who many believed were guilty. The case was far from over, however. The collapse of the trial in 2008 was not the end of the Charlene Downs case. Police continued to investigate, and in 2014, further charges were brought. This time, Iyad al-Batiki was charged not with murder but with attempting to pervert the course of justice, accused of providing false information to the original investigation. The case went to trial in 2015, but again ended without conviction. The charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. For Charlene's family, particularly her mother Karen, these repeated failures of the justice system were agonizing. Karen Downs became a tireless advocate for her daughter, giving interviews, maintaining pressure on police, refusing to let Charlene's case fade from public consciousness. But the Charlene Downs case had implications far beyond one family's tragedy. It became a lightning rod for discussions about child sexual exploitation, about failures in the child protection system, about difficult questions of race and culture and safeguarding. In the years following Charlene's disappearance, similar cases emerged from other towns across England. Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Telford. In each of these places, patterns of exploitation were uncovered involving vulnerable young girls, often from troubled backgrounds or in care, being systematically groomed and abused by groups of men. The common factors in many of these cases were troubling. The victims were often dismissed as troubled teenagers making bad choices rather than as children being exploited. Their reports of abuse were not taken seriously. Social services and police often failed to act decisively to protect them. And in many cases, there was a reluctance among authorities to confront the fact that many of the perpetrators were from South Asian backgrounds, specifically of Pakistani heritage. This reluctance, driven by concerns about community relations and fears of being accused of racism, allowed exploitation to continue unchecked. Charlene Downs' case, while it predated the wider revelations of grooming gangs, fit this pattern. She was a vulnerable white girl from a troubled background, exploited by older men, failed by the systems meant to protect her. The case raised uncomfortable questions. Why had Charlene been allowed to spend so much time with adult men without intervention? Why had her repeated disappearances from home not triggered more robust safeguarding measures? Why had warning signs been ignored? The answers pointed to systemic failures across multiple agencies. Social services were overwhelmed and underfunded. Police didn't recognize grooming as the serious crime it was. Society viewed girls like Charlene as complicit in their own abuse rather than as victims. Charlene Downs was failed in life, and many would argue she was failed in death as well. Today, more than 20 years after Charlene Downs disappeared, her case remains officially unsolved. She has never been found. No one has been convicted of any crime related to her disappearance or presumed death. Lancashire police have never closed the investigation. Over the years, they've followed hundreds of leads, conducted multiple searches, interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses and suspects. In 2019, they conducted a large-scale excavation at a building in Blackpool based on new information, searching for Charlene's remains. Nothing was found. The force has maintained that they believe Charlene was murdered shortly after she was last seen on November 1, 2003. They believe her body was disposed of in a way that makes recovery unlikely. But belief, however strong, is not the same as proof. For Charlene's mother, Karen, the years since her daughter's disappearance have been marked by grief, frustration, and an unending search for answers. She has fought tirelessly to keep Charlene's case in the public eye, to pressure authorities to continue investigating, to honor her daughter's memory. Karen has been critical of how the original investigation was handled, of decisions made during the prosecution of suspects, of what she sees as systemic failures that allowed her daughter to be exploited and then let those responsible escape justice. She has also become an advocate for other families in similar situations, lending her voice to campaigns for better protection of vulnerable children and stronger prosecution of those who exploit them. The Charlene Downs case has led to changes in how child sexual exploitation is recognized and addressed in the UK. Police now have specialized units dealing with such cases. Social services are better trained to recognize grooming patterns. There's greater awareness of the manipulation and control that characterizes these crimes. But for Karen Downs, these changes came too late for Charlene. Charlene would be 35 years old now if she's still alive. But no one who knew the case believes she is. Most accept that Charlene died in November 2003, a victim of exploitation that escalated to murder, a child who fell through every safety net that should have caught her. The story of Charlene Downs is difficult to hear. It's uncomfortable. It forces us to confront failures and injustices that implicate not just individuals but entire systems and societies. Charlene was a child, 14 years old. Whatever her circumstances, whatever her choices, she was a child who deserved protection. She deserved adults who would safeguard her, not exploit her. She deserved a society that would recognize her vulnerability and intervene. She deserved better than she got. Her disappearance exposed a dark underbelly of exploitation in Blackpool and prompted similar revelations across England. It contributed to a national reckoning with how vulnerable children were being failed by those meant to protect them. But acknowledgement of failure doesn't bring Charlene back. It doesn't give her mother the closure of knowing what happened, of being able to bury her daughter, of seeing justice done. Lancashire police continue to appeal for information about Charlene's disappearance. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened to her on November 1st, 2003. Someone knows where she is. Someone carries the burden of that knowledge. If you have any information about Charlene Downs, no matter how insignificant it might seem, Lancashire police want to hear from you. Anonymous tips can be provided. After 20 years, there may be reasons to speak that didn't exist before. Circumstances change. Consciences weigh heavy. The truth has a way of emerging eventually. Charlene's life mattered. Her disappearance matters. The injustice of her case matters. She should not be forgotten, should not become just another statistic of a failed child, a cold case file gathering dust. She was a daughter, a sister, a young girl who loved music and chatting with friends, who wanted attention and affection, who got lost in a world that should have protected her but instead consumed her. If this story has affected you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Charlene's story. Keep her case alive in public consciousness. Sometimes that's what finally brings the breakthrough that solves a case. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering Charlene Downs. Story 3. Before we begin tonight's journey, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Check the time. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you're settling in to hear this story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these mysteries that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a man who spent decades prosecuting criminals, seeking justice, upholding the law. A man who was respected in his community, trusted by his colleagues, known for his integrity. A man who, one spring day in 2005, drove away from his home and was never seen again. This is the story of Ray Gricker, the district attorney who vanished. Ray Frank Gricker was born on October 9, 1945, in Cleveland, Ohio. He grew up in a working-class family during the post-war boom years, a time of optimism and opportunity in America. Ray was intelligent, driven, focused, the kind of young man who understood that education was the pathway to a better life. He attended Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, earning his undergraduate degree before moving on to law school. He graduated from Case Western Reserve School of Law in 1971 with his Juris Doctor, ready to begin his legal career. Ray didn't go into corporate law or private practice. Instead, he chose public service. He became a prosecutor, dedicating himself to the pursuit of justice on behalf of the people. It was a calling more than a career. In the mid-1980s, Ray Gricker moved to Centre County, Pennsylvania. Centre County sits in the geographic center of the state, encompassing State College, home to Pennsylvania State University. Penn State, as it's known, dominates the area both physically and economically. The university is the largest employer, and the community revolves around it. In 1985, Ray Gricker was elected district attorney of Centre County. He would hold that position for the next 20 years, becoming one of the longest-serving DAs in Pennsylvania history. Ray was good at his job. Exceptionally good. His conviction rate was impressive. He was known as a tough prosecutor who prepared his cases meticulously, who understood the law deeply, who could present complex evidence clearly to juries. He was respected by law enforcement, by judges, by his fellow attorneys even when they opposed him in court. But Ray wasn't just a courtroom warrior. He was also known for his thoughtfulness, his willingness to consider alternatives to prosecution when appropriate. He was an early advocate for drug courts and treatment programs for nonviolent offenders. He understood that the justice system should seek rehabilitation as well as punishment. Those who worked with Ray described him as intelligent, reserved, private. He wasn't particularly social outside of work. He didn't seek the spotlight or publicity. He simply did his job day after day, year after year, building cases and seeking convictions. By 2005, Ray was 59 years old. He'd been DA for 2 decades. He was approaching retirement, planning to step down later that year and transition into a different phase of his life. He'd been through a divorce years earlier but had found happiness with his girlfriend, Patty Fornicala. They'd been together for several years, living together, planning a future. Ray had a daughter from his previous marriage, Laura, who was grown and living her own life. He had hobbies, interests outside of work. He enjoyed music, particularly the Beatles. He liked to travel. He was learning to play guitar. Life was good. Retirement was on the horizon. Ray Gricker had built a successful career and was ready to enjoy the fruits of that success. On the morning of April 15, 2005, Ray told Patty he was going to drive to nearby Lewisburg, about 60 miles from their home in Belafonte. He said he wanted to shop for antiques, something he enjoyed doing. It would be a day trip, nothing unusual. Patty had no reason to be concerned. Ray often took drives, especially on pleasant spring days. He'd be back by evening. Ray Gricker walked out of his home that Friday morning, got into his red Mini Cooper, and drove away. He has never been seen since. Friday, April 15th, 2005, was a mild spring day in central Pennsylvania. Temperatures in the 60s, partly cloudy, the kind of day that makes you want to be outside after a long winter. Ray left his home in Bellefonte around 11:30 in the morning. Bellefonte is a small town just a few miles from State College, the seat of Center County. Ray and Patty lived in a comfortable townhouse there, a quiet neighborhood, nothing remarkable. Ray drove his distinctive red Mini Cooper southeast toward Lewisburg. The route would take him along Route 192 and then Route 45, winding through the valleys and farmland of central Pennsylvania. It's beautiful country, especially in spring when everything is greening up after winter. Lewisburg sits on the banks of the Susquehanna River, about 60 miles from Bellefonte. It's a small town, population around 6,000, home to Bucknell University. It has a charming downtown with antique shops, bookstores, cafes. Exactly the kind of place Ray enjoyed visiting. But here's where the story takes its first strange turn. Phone records would later show that Ray's cell phone was used to call Patty sometime around mid-morning. He told her he was on his way to Lewisburg, that everything was fine, that he'd see her later. But witnesses would place Ray and his Mini Cooper not in Lewisburg, but in a different town entirely. At approximately 12:50 p.m., a truck driver saw Ray's distinctive red Mini Cooper parked on the walking bridge that spans the Susquehanna River in Lewisburg, but not the main Lewisburg. This was in the neighboring small town of Riverside, just across the river. The truck driver noticed the car because it was unusual to see a vehicle parked on that particular bridge, which was primarily used by pedestrians. The driver saw a man matching Ray's description standing near the car, possibly on the bridge, looking out at the river. The witness didn't think much of it at the time, just someone enjoying the view on a nice day. Later that afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., a woman reported seeing a man matching Ray's description, along with a woman with dark hair, on the same bridge. According to this witness, they were cigarette smoking and appeared to be in conversation. The woman was described as younger, perhaps in her 30s or 40s, dark-haired. Ray Gricker did not smoke, and if he was with a woman, it wasn't Patty, who was home in Bellefonte waiting for him. These sightings would become critical pieces of the puzzle, and deeply confusing ones. Who was the woman? Why was Ray on that particular bridge? Why had he deviated from his stated plan to shop for antiques? As evening approached and Ray didn't return home, Patty began to worry. By nightfall, her worry had turned to real concern. Ray always called if he was going to be late. He was reliable, predictable. This wasn't like him. By late evening, Patty contacted law enforcement. Ray Gricker, the district attorney of Center County, was missing. When a district attorney goes missing, it's taken seriously from the start. Ray Gricker wasn't just any citizen. He was a prominent law enforcement official, someone who'd put criminals in prison, someone who potentially had enemies. The initial investigation moved quickly. Ray's cell phone records were pulled. His last known location was triangulated. His credit cards were checked. His bank accounts were monitored. What investigators found was puzzling. Ray's cell phone had last pinged off a tower near Lewisburg around mid-afternoon on April 15th. After that, nothing. The phone had either been turned off or destroyed. His credit cards showed no activity after the morning of April 15th. No purchases, no withdrawals, nothing. His bank accounts were untouched. Ray had recently deposited his paycheck, and the money sat there, unaccessed. On April 16th, the day after Ray disappeared, his red Mini Cooper was found. It was parked in a lot near the walking bridge where witnesses had seen it the previous day. The car was locked. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious evidence of foul play. Inside the car, investigators found Ray's cell phone charger and his keys in the ignition. But no cell phone, no wallet, no Ray. The car was immediately impounded and processed for evidence. Forensic teams went over every inch of it. They found nothing unusual. No blood, no signs of violence, no evidence that Ray had been attacked or forced from the vehicle. But the cigarette lighter in the car had been used recently. And remember, Ray didn't smoke. Search teams were deployed along the Susquehanna River. If Ray had jumped from the bridge, if he'd fallen in, if he'd drowned, his body might have been carried downstream by the current. Divers searched the river. Dogs tracked along the banks. Helicopters surveyed from above. They found nothing. Investigators interviewed people in Lewisburg and Riverside. Had anyone seen Ray? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? The witnesses who'd seen the Mini Cooper and the man on the bridge came forward. But no one could identify the mysterious dark-haired woman seen with him. Detectives began constructing theories. Had Ray been meeting someone? Was the antique shopping story a cover for some other purpose? Had he been lured to that location by someone? Had he gone there of his own accord for reasons no one understood? Or had Ray Gricker, for reasons known only to himself, chosen to disappear? The investigation into Ray Gricker's disappearance continued through the spring and into summer of 2005. Tips came in. Possible sightings were investigated. All proved to be false leads or cases of mistaken identity. Then, 3 months after Ray vanished, a significant piece of evidence was discovered. In July 2005, a fisherman along the Susquehanna River, about 8 miles downstream from where Ray's car had been found, noticed something unusual in the shallow water. It was a laptop computer, partially buried in silt and river debris. The fisherman reported his find to authorities. The laptop was recovered and sent to forensic analysis. It was determined to be Ray Gricker's work laptop, a computer he'd checked out from the DA's office and had been using. This was a major break in the case. A laptop belonging to a missing district attorney, found in a river. Whatever information had been on that computer might explain what happened to Ray. But there was a problem. The laptop had been in the water for months. Water damage to electronics is catastrophic under the best circumstances. After 3 months submerged in a river, exposed to silt, currents, and temperature changes, the damage was severe. Forensic computer experts attempted to recover data from the hard drive. They used every technique available in 2005 to extract information. But the hard drive was too damaged. Most of the data was irrecoverable. What they could determine was troubling. Prior to being damaged by water, the hard drive had been deliberately wiped. Someone had used software to delete files and overwrite data, making recovery difficult even if the drive had been in perfect condition. Someone had intentionally destroyed the information on Ray Gricker's laptop before it ended up in the Susquehanna River. The question was, who? Had Ray himself wiped the drive, then disposed of the laptop in the river? So why? What had been on that computer that needed to be so thoroughly destroyed? Or had someone else done it? Had whoever met Ray on that bridge taken the laptop, wiped it, and thrown it in the river to eliminate evidence? The discovery of the laptop raised more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, for months after the laptop was found, another piece of evidence surfaced. In October 2005, also about 8 miles from where the car had been found, the hard drive from the laptop was discovered on the banks of the Susquehanna River. Not the entire laptop this time, just the hard drive. It had been removed from the laptop casing and had ended up separately in the river system. This was highly unusual. Hard drives don't typically separate from laptops naturally. The discovery suggested deliberate disassembly. Someone had taken the laptop apart, removed the hard drive, and disposed of both pieces separately in the river. The hard drive was as damaged and unreadable as the laptop had been. Any secrets it held were gone forever. As the investigation continued with no sign of Ray Gricker, theories about his disappearance proliferated. The first and most obvious theory was foul play. Ray had been a prosecutor for 20 years. He'd sent people to prison. He'd made enemies. Had someone from his past decided to exact revenge? Had a criminal or a family member of someone Ray had prosecuted decided to kill him? Investigators looked into this possibility extensively. They reviewed Ray's cases, particularly recent ones and those involving violent offenders. They interviewed people Ray had prosecuted who'd been released from prison. They looked for threats, for grudges, for motives. They found nothing concrete. Ray hadn't received any recent threats. There were no obvious candidates for revenge. And the circumstances of his disappearance didn't fit a revenge killing. Why lure him to Lewisburg? Why the elaborate setup with the laptop? A revenge killing would more likely be direct, personal, violent. Another theory focused on Ray's work, but from a different angle. What if Ray had stumbled onto something in an investigation? Something that made him a target for more organized criminals? Center County wasn't a major crime hotspot, but it wasn't immune to drug trafficking, corruption, or other serious criminal activity. Had Ray been investigating something sensitive? Had he uncovered information that made him dangerous to someone powerful? Again, investigators found no evidence to support this. Ray's recent cases were reviewed. There was nothing that stood out as particularly dangerous or unusual. Then there was the theory that many found uncomfortable but impossible to ignore: suicide. Ray's brother, Roy Gricker, had died by suicide in 1996. Jumping from the Great Falls of the Potomac River near Washington, D.C. Roy had been successful, seemingly happy, with no obvious warning signs. His suicide had shocked everyone who knew him. Could Ray have been struggling with similar demons? Could he have driven to that bridge intending to end his life the same way his brother had? The theory had some support. Ray had been experiencing some health issues, including a back problem that caused him significant pain. He'd been taking medication for it. Some people who knew him said he'd seemed stressed in the months before his disappearance, though others said he seemed fine, looking forward to retirement. But there were problems with the suicide theory. Ray was planning his retirement. He and Patty had been looking at property in North Carolina where they wanted to live. He'd been learning guitar, planning trips. These weren't the actions of someone planning to die. More significantly, Ray's body had never been found. The Susquehanna River had been thoroughly searched. Bodies that enter rivers are usually recovered eventually, especially given the intensive search that had been conducted. And then there was the laptop. Why would someone contemplating suicide go through the elaborate process of wiping a hard drive and disposing of a computer? This led to perhaps the most intriguing theory. Ray Gricker had voluntarily disappeared. He'd planned his exit, executed it, and was alive somewhere living under a new identity. The theory that Ray Gricker had deliberately vanished and started a new life elsewhere might sound far-fetched, but it had some compelling evidence supporting it. First, Ray had been researching how to destroy data on a hard drive in the weeks before his disappearance. His internet search history showed he'd been looking up information about wiping drives, about permanently deleting data, about making information unrecoverable. Why would a district attorney about to retire be researching data destruction unless he was planning something? Second, witnesses had reported seeing Ray in various locations after April 15, 2005. While most of these sightings were likely cases of mistaken identity, some were intriguing. A man matching Ray's description was reportedly seen in Michigan. Another sighting came from Texas. A particularly detailed report came from someone who claimed to see Ray at a truck stop in Ohio, though this witness couldn't be certain it was him. Third, there was no body. If Ray had died by suicide or been murdered, his body should have turned up eventually. The fact that it hadn't suggested he might be alive.